Oh, well, thank you so much. Good morning from Vancouver, Canada. And thank you to everyone at Broadside Extra for having me. Yes, my name is Sarah. I'm so happy to be here. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just going to go ahead get started here. As long as everyone can hear me and see me, or I guess you don't need to see me, but that's fine. I can't see the chat right now, but I will look at it when I'm finished my presentation. So let's get started. Throughout Britain's long 18th century, the chapbook was a widely disseminated and culturally significant form of cheap print. Predominantly considered lowbrow productions in both their materiality and contents, these short, flimsily bound booklets comprising memoirs, stories, songs, and tales were produced by and for the working and middle classes. Contributing prolifically to the cheap print industry was female chapbook publisher Anne Lemoine, who surpassed the literary output of all of her peers in this period for her production of at least 400 chapbooks. So recent scholarship from Roy Bearden White, Franz J. Potter, and Michelle Levy have begun to establish Lemoine's extensive bibliography and with it her influential presence within the book trade. Despite their important studies, however, the cultural role and textual contents of chapbooks themselves continue to remain largely overlooked by book and literary historians because of their transience and rare association with known authors, a condition through which most books enter scholarly discussion. A majority of these print forms have not been collected, preserved, or even described to the same degree as their more durable counterparts. Given the prioritization of book history toward deluxe print or non-cheap print and literary history toward the author, more research is needed to bring other print forms and their makers forward. So this presentation today builds on the work of previous scholars to use Lemoine and her anonymous chapbooks as a case study to explore how bibliography can account for cheap print and women's labor. So as Paula McDowell, Marissa J. Fuentes, Kate Osmond, and others have shown, women's contributions to print beyond authorship are largely omitted from book history. Recent scholarship, such as a few examples shown here, have helped to illustrate a fuller picture of 18th century women's labor in print production. By recovering women's roles beyond authorship in the book trades, we can dismantle prevailing narratives of women's labor as anomalous and more accurately trace their intellectual, social, and economic engagement with print. So today I'll combine a sort of case study approach with archival research to describe how Lemoine and her chapbooks embody several bibliographical challenges within the larger context of 18th century British book history. Lemoine was chosen for this examination because her unusual productivity and visibility in the imprints not only facilitate a precise analysis of her contributions to print, but also illuminate an example of book history's cultural leftovers, to borrow Laurie Humphrey Newcomb's phrase, of cheap print and women's labor. So I'll first discuss the challenges as I encountered them of creating bibliographical and economic metadata on her chapbooks for the Women's Print History Project, a comprehensive database on women's contributions to books from 18th century England, Scotland, Ireland, America, and France. Then I'll illustrate how metadata produced by major institutions, often the main sources for their digitization efforts, privilege these deluxe print forms and explore several archival barriers that hinder the study of cheap print. And then a closer look at the corpus of data about Lemoine's chapbooks also reveals that her contributions to print far exceeded what is listed in the British Book Trade Index. And as a publisher, bookseller, and possibly printer and reader, Lemoine single-handedly occupied almost all of the nodes in Dartmouth's communications circuit. And a reorientation towards Lemoine's largely anonymous chapbooks, as I argue throughout, joins the wave of change that demands space for more marginalized peoples and products of book and literary history. So Anne Lemoine's publishing premises were located in White Rose Court, London, at the cusp of the 18th century. Much of what we know about her derives from studies of her ex-husband, Henry Lemoine. They married in 1786 when he was at the peak of his career as an author, printer, and bookseller. In 1794, Henry spiraled into debt and faced imprisonment when he could not sustain his copper plate printing business, and Anne Lemoine's separation from Henry a year later thus became a catalyst for her own cultural ingenuities in the book industry. Capturing a picture of this chapbook industry, and incidentally Lemoine's role within it, is Angela Koch's checklist of 217 19th century blue books from the Oct0ber Library. As we can see, leading chapbook publishers Dean and Munday and Tegg and Castleman appear in 33 and 35 imprints respectively. Lemoine almost doubles their efforts by appearing in 67 imprints, or 30% of this list, demonstrating her prominence in the cheap print industry. Roy Bearden-White's MA thesis is the first comprehensive examination of Lemoine and her two-decade career. By synthesizing records from open access online catalogs, he has compiled a bibliography comprising 201 of Lemoine's chapbooks. In amalgamating her scattered archive, Bearden-White estimates that her total number of separate chapbooks was approximately 400, an achievement comparable to Virginia and Leonard Woolf's Hogarth Press, which published just over 500 works 100 years later. Virtually every major library in North America, he claims, owns at least one Lemoine chapbook. So, in the summer of 2020, I was offered the task to further scour the library catalogs for traces of Lemoine and her works from a variety of open access sources such as HathiTrust Digital Library, Google Books, and archive.org for the Women's Print History Project. With the help of Bearden-White's bibliographical spadework, I have found and recorded over 80 of Lemoine's chapbooks for a total of 280 and counting. So I'm now going to discuss some of the challenges that emerged when collecting this metadata. I'll first compare Lemoine's bibliography with the bibliography of another prolific contributor to deluxe print, Amelia Opie, to offer a glimpse into how cheap and deluxe print forms are treated in full-text digital resources. Given that 93% of Lemoine's recovered titles were published during the early 19th century, the database 19th Century Collections Online, or NECO, seems a logical place to ascertain the digitization efforts of cheap print. For example, a general search for Anne Lemoine in this database, or A. Lemoine, displays 4 monograph and 3 newspaper and periodical results. A Boolean search in quotation marks produces 2 results, both that appear in the general search. Most strikingly, none of these results derive from any imprint or colophon where Lemoine consistently signed her name. An advanced search for Anne Lemoine, or A. Lemoine, in the author-creator field, on the other hand, produces 0 results. Even broader perusal of Lemoine and NECO yields results references to titles by her husband, and oddly, several manuscripts of Lord Chamberlain's plays. It would appear that the handwritten word Chamberlain translates to Lemoine in OCR plain text. As the results show, Lemoine's digital footprint in this database is a near absent, even though she, as far as we know, signed her name on all of her works. So I've chosen Amelia Opie as a comparison, not only for her prolific output, but also because she was, like Lemoine, operating primarily within early 19th century London and occupied several roles during her lifetime. Since she produced most of her works throughout the 19th century, Opie's books can also be traced throughout NECO. So a general search of Amelia Opie and Amelia Alderson Opie produces 100 unfiltered results, including memoirs, biographies, and portraits of the writer. An advanced search of Opie as author-creator lists over 30 monographs, most of which are various editions of her Adeline Mowbray and multiple volumes of her Simple Tales. So, in other words, Lemoine produced 80% more titles than Opie during the early 19th century, but there are 0 books attributed to Lemoine in NECO. We must consider Leah Orr's recent argument that no one source gives the complete picture of the print culture world, and that all of the sources give strikingly different views, despite often having the illusion of comprehensiveness. Because NECO only shows a portion of the preservation efforts for cheap and deluxe print, it's necessary to consult as many sources as possible to better map the presence. So in this case, we have a complete list of OB titles from the Amelia Alderson OB archive, and a reasonably complete list of titles for Lemoyne from the Women's Print History Project, because we consult so many sources. As Figure 1 displays, 67 of 280 of Lemoyne's chapbooks, or 24%, are digitized in the Women's Print History Project, opposite OB's 43%. So the comparison of Lemoyne and OB is by no means conclusive, but it does demonstrate that cheap print and women's labor beyond authorship is largely excluded from digital repositories. Certainly, there are multiple variables that must be considered, such as their textual contents, the number of scholars and institutions that take an interest in them, and of course, a book's overall survival in the first place. So first, let us consider archival bias toward authorship. Although she produced at least 254 books from 1800 onward, Lemoyne's titles are completely absent from NECO, likely the first source that an institutionally affiliated researcher interested in her works might consult. One reason for her absence from NECO in particular might be because it derives its corpus from 1980s microfiche, meaning that its search results produce texts from primarily the British and Bodleian libraries. As Lawrence Evelyn writes, ECHO, the sister database of NECO, might easily reflect 1980s priorities about what kinds of works are worth investing in. These skewed results are therefore gleaned from archives and institutions that, for all intents and purposes, privilege one form of labor. This leads to my second point. We must also consider the limitations of databases such as NECO that rely on human labor. So Kate Moffat and Candace Sharon discuss at length the accidental inclusion of incorrect data about a firm and how it may snowball into inaccuracies. Because many sources extract data from other major libraries, it's possible that despite researchers' best efforts, some information may have fallen through the cracks. So considering these obstacles, it's rather remarkable for scholars to have explored the cultural transactions and literary labor of someone like Lemoyne in the first place. At this point, there's no way to know if her output was unusual because we have few, if any, cheap print publishers with which to compare. So the first part of this presentation sort of walked through the challenges of excavating Lemoyne and her books from the literary trenches, but what can we learn once we've actually recovered her books? The Women's Print History Project title records reveal that Lemoyne's chapbooks were fairly consistent in shape and size. R.C. Simmons, drawing from Victor Newberg, describes them as small paper-covered books, approximately 3.5 by 6 inches, and consistently 4, 8, 12, 16, or 24 pages. So most of Lemoyne's early books are slightly larger than Newberg's description, with duodecimal dimensions slightly larger than an iPhone 11 Pro. They remain fairly static in price at 6 pence, but generally cost more than other chapbooks of the period, which are about anywhere from 2 to 3 pence usually. So we can also track Lemoyne's productivity and partnerships through the imprints. As Figure 2 shows, she produced over 100 titles from 1804 to 1807 alone. Her early titles reveal that she enlisted publisher John Rowe at the start of her career. In 1803, he was named as a regular collaborator, where he participated in a noteworthy 68% of her titles. Although Franz J. Potter claims that Lemoyne effectively closed her shop in 1812, she still produced 13 titles from this year until 1822. She ultimately concludes her 2-decade career publishing The Lear of Love with John Rowe as first associate. According to Potter, Lemoyne and Rowe married on April 30th, 1822, before vanishing from the archive altogether. Apart from contracting other reliable partnerships, such as copperplate printer Thomas Maiden and booksellers Thomas Hurst and John Lee, Lemoyne undertook several roles herself. Displayed primarily in the imprints as a publisher, she was also a bookseller and possibly a printer. In 1796, a year in which she put forth only 2 publications, she undertook a book-selling role likely to cut costs during the early stages of her career. As Figure 3 illustrates, this particular title was a reprint of Walpole's The Mysterious Mother. Less is known about Lemoine as printer, however. Bearden White's bibliographer credits her as a printer of Hernan Cortez's The History of the Conquest of Mexico. Regrettably, there are no digitizations of this book, although I've had the absolute privilege of viewing this particular edition at the British Library last month, and needless to say, I took very many selfies. But you can imagine my disappointment, however, when I found that the book was published but not printed by her as stated by Bearden White. According to him, this is the only edition associated with Lemoine. A more ambiguous record of Lemoine as printer arises from The Old Castle, or 40 Knights and the Fair Penitent, a copy that is only digitized. This colophon for the title, however, simply reads Lemoine Printer, Chiswell Street, London. This is the only record that displays Lemoine's surname on its own, and it's very likely that Henry printed this title, having relocated to Chiswell from Parliament Street in approximately 1807, and having printed for her at least 5 times previously. As the records show, Lemoine herself is only known to publish down the block in White Rose Court. There are many aspects of book and literary history that are not prioritized, preserved, or digitized. The case of Lemoine further begs us to recover even more marginalized figures in the book trade that are too often hidden in plain sight. Bibliography has the potential to recover women like Lemoine, whose prolific output derives from her precise understanding of her audience and consistent collaborations. Lemoine proudly displayed her name among at least 280 imprints to immortalize her expert navigation of the chapbook trade as a woman among men. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating, and I loved your books. I had noticed that you were working on Anne Lemoine, and it's really a very interesting subject. So look forward to more of your work. So does anybody have any questions for Sarah? I'll have a look in the chat and see if there's any there. Are you looking in the chat, Harry?
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting to the end of the day.
People can't think of any questions now, can they? Yeah?
Very interesting talk. I just had a question in relation to her themes, in the data. I just was wondering, about the, that she was working within certain genres. Were they allowed? Were women more prevalent, like for example, and she'd be sort of her readership women, you know what I mean? Like she had a sort of, okay, I'm going to
repeat your question. So Sarah, I don't know if you can hear that, Sarah, but was Anne Lemoine's readership, did it tend to be women? Was she working in genres that were more read by women, or was that not, did that not apply?
The daring do men, these sort of heroic soldiery types. I was wondering if there were Mills and Booths.
That's a fantastic question. Lemoine's readership was primarily middle class and working women in the period, and she produced a large amount of prostitute narratives, a lot of narratives about sex work and women's labor, various forms of women labor like herself. She produced works about female pirates, female highwaymen, or highway, how do you say it? I don't know how to say that.
Highway women?
Yes, highway women. There we go. And sort of these odd figures drawn from various forms of life. And it's quite interesting, because I feel like that's often not presented in cheap print, or even forms of non-cheap print as well, seeing these kind of odd forms of women's labor that is not often shown: sex work, pirates, female robbers as well. So yes, she has a very interesting sort of oeuvre to sort of scour through, and I've had the opportunity to read some of her prostitute narratives as well. Quite fascinating too. I wish there was just a bit more information about them because a lot of them were anonymous. We can only see that she was a publisher of these books, and not much else. So I wish we could find more about the books, who their author was, and a bit more about their sort of cultural transactions in the book trade.
Excellent. I see that David Atkinson is asking, how do you know who was her readership? Are you inferring from the subject matter, or do you know that the readership were women mostly?
Fantastic question. So yes, we do know that her readership was women. Franz J. Potter and Michelle Levy have both slightly different articles that do discuss her readership. So I think they've extrapolated that from the content, yes. But also it seems like many chapbook sort of readers at large were women, and they would purchase these little books, share them with their families, sing the songs, or share the little tales with their families as well. There's still a lot of research to be done on the matter.
It's just reminded me, Sarah, of Louisa May Alcott, who remember in the story, or as Jo, and I presume she is Jo in the Little Women books. At one stage she's writing these Penny Dreadfuls, and she's very ashamed then to be caught writing them. She's ashamed in front of her like wonderful father and mother to be writing these dreadful things. And I'm just kind of thinking there must have been a market of women writing those kind of books. I mean, why would it be such a popular book as Little Women? It was obviously not uncommon, maybe.
Yeah, no, of course, there is definitely a market. Again, it's unclear to sort of tell who exactly was writing these books because there's no author listed. They're often anonymous. But generally, it seems like a lot of earlier scholarship on chapbooks describe them as sort of being abridgments or ripoffs from larger novels. For example, Lemoyne does publish this sort of Chaucer ripoff of a chapbook. Instead of naming it the Canterbury Tales, she sort of switches the title of it to I forget the real title, but it's supposed to sound like Canterbury Tales, but it sort of draws in that readership in a kind of sneaky way.
So I see Oscar Cox-Denson as well as asking a question. Mention of Opie reminds me of her songs with titles like By the Author of X. Is tracing these references an extra challenge? Is it gendered? And how do you solve it? And he said that was great, by the way.
Yes, and that is a great question too. Yes, it's so difficult to track down books in digital repositories because a lot of the information is trickled down from external resources as well. So yes, the author of X, yes, that is a gendered challenge as well, trying to find this information because a lot of the times we don't know. In Opie's case, it is easier because she is a known author. Her titles are often in databases such as NECO or HathiTrust or Google Books. Someone whose works are not attributed to authorship, like publishers like Lemoyne, are of course more difficult to trace. And also we don't know how publishers in the period always consistently sign their name, often on imprints, but sometimes they would hide their names in the back of books as well. And sometimes digitizations doesn't always capture that information. So it is a challenge. Yes, it's a fun one. It's a fun kind of puzzle to crack, and I'm so excited and grateful that I've been granted the opportunity to try and find these. But it's always a challenge working in digital humanities because information is always captured so variably.
I think people here probably can sympathize with you, because for instance in ballads you might not get the publisher, you might not get the author, you might not get the first line, you might just get the title. So you know, it can be very frustrating what somebody's chosen to catalogue, you know, so that's probably a similar problem. So yeah, Oscar's agreeing with us there. Anybody else got a question? Yes, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, it's been remarked earlier today that a lot of women became printers because they took over from a deceased husband or a deceased father or whatever. Do you have sort of data, or are you investigating the sort of routes by which women got into the book trade?
Yes, did you hear that question, Sarah? Are you investigating by what routes women got into the book trade? For instance, in my paper earlier, I was talking about women took over from their husbands and their fathers, and obviously Anne Lemoine was married to a printer, a publisher, and then set up her own business when they separated. So I'm just wondering, are there other people you're working on, and have you got that kind of information?
That's a great question too. It's hard to track that kind of, or it's easy to track the information from how women like Lemoine started in the business, because usually their husbands or brothers or sons were prominent figures in the trade, and from there we can extrapolate data about her books. At this point, I work as a researcher for the Women's Print History Project, which is a database on women's books. And basically, we're trying to track down every female contributor to print in this period. And oftentimes they are associated with, they have male relations in the trade already, as discussed. But oftentimes there is like a woman who has no connections whatsoever and kind of just pops in there. Trying to think of an example offhand. Another example, like Lemoine, actually, there's these three family members in the Farleys in Bristol. They were part of a newspaper printing trade and cheap print as well. And again, we know about them because their great-grandfather was one of the main newspaper printers in the period. And from there, from newspaper archives, we can track the names of his relations. And from there, we found all this information about Sarah, Hester Farley, and another Farley that I'm forgetting. And yeah, it's certainly it's a lot easier for us when there's male relations, but it's often frustrating too, because we only get to these women because of their male relations at times, and it's difficult to navigate too, because sometimes in the imprints they will share the last name of a male relation and they might not add the first name, or they might just have an initial. So it is a gendered challenge, as Oscar was saying, because women don't always add their names in the imprints consistently or in a way that makes them easy to find.
Thank you, Sarah. One from Steve.
Just comment on talking about London printers of Broadsides, the two biggest printers of the first half of the 19th century was John Pitts and Jimmy Catnap, as mentioned. Both of those, when they retired, their business was carried on by women. In Catnap's case, it was Mrs. Ryle, I think it was his niece. But in Pitts's case, Elizabeth Hodges, I think, was his housekeeper or something like that. No relation anyway. So certainly on the broadside, London broadside trade in the 1830s, 40s, two major imprints were run by women who had not actually been married to the previous one. So there's certainly, as far as I know, nobody's looked into. We know a lot about Pitts and Catnap. We know very little about
Ryle and Hodges.
Ryle and Hodges.
Hodges.
Should do that.
So do you have those names, Sarah, in your sites?
Offhand, I don't know. We have about 18,000 titles now, so I don't have them all memorized. That name doesn't ring a bell, but I will have to take note of that.
One print was Catnap and and Pitts, isn't it? Pitts, and their business has been taken over by Ryle and Hodges, to women, unrelated women, or maybe a niece and an unrelated woman.
Yeah.
So that's a contribution from Steve Roud anyway. Anybody else got a question? Because we're about to segue into our final discussion here. Yours is the last paper of the day, Sarah. Oscar's just chipping in that other people like Margaret Angus in Newcastle, but mid-19th century moment where all the ballot presses are in the hands of women is so interesting and unexplored. So there you are. So Harry has reminded me that sorry, will we give Sarah a clap?